Sarah Chun had always been good at reading maps, but the paper in her hands felt different now. The creases were worn from folding and unfolding, and small drops of sweat had made some of the ink run slightly. She was crouched behind a large rock formation, trying to make sense of where exactly she had ended up. 3 days ago, she had been sitting in a comfortable office in Washington, D.C., reviewing intelligence reports about a small village in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now she was actually here, and nothing looked the way it did in the satellite photos. Sarah worked as a cultural advisor for the military. Her job was to help soldiers understand local customs and traditions so they could work better with village leaders and community members. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had spent years studying the region. But all that knowledge felt useless when she was lost and alone in terrain that wanted to kill her. The helicopter that was supposed to take her to the forward operating base had developed mechanical problems 2 hours into the flight. The pilot had managed to land safely in a flat area between 2 hills, but the radio was completely dead. They had tried everything to fix it, but nothing worked. "Ma'am, we need to stay with the bird," Sergeant Martinez had told her. "Standard procedure is to wait for rescue when you have a mechanical failure." But Sarah had looked at her watch and then at the map. The village she needed to reach was only 8 miles away according to her GPS device. There was an important meeting scheduled for the next morning between American forces and local tribal leaders. Without her there to help with translation and cultural guidance, the meeting could go very badly. "How long until they realize we're missing?" she had asked. "Could be 6 hours, could be 12. Depends on radio check schedules and weather." Sarah had made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but now felt incredibly stupid. She would hike to the village alone while the helicopter crew stayed to guard their aircraft and wait for rescue. 8 miles over mountain terrain in a country she knew well from books and briefings. How hard could it be? Very hard, as it turned out. The first problem came after just 2 hours of walking. The trail she was following suddenly split into 3 different paths, and none of them matched what her map showed. She had tried using her GPS device, but the mountains were blocking the satellite signal. For 20 minutes, she had walked in circles, trying to figure out which way to go. She chose the middle path, which seemed to head in the right general direction. But after another hour of walking, she realized she was going downhill when she should have been going up. The village was supposed to be on higher ground, not lower. By the time she admitted she was lost, the sun was starting to set. Sarah had never been alone in hostile territory before. In training exercises, there were always safety measures and backup plans. Here, if something went wrong, nobody would know where to look for her. She found a small cave to spend the night in. It was really just a deep crack in a rock face, but it would keep her hidden and mostly warm. Sarah had a sleeping bag, 3 bottles of water, and some energy bars. She also had a pistol that she barely knew how to use and a radio that could only reach about 5 miles in perfect conditions. The sounds of the mountains at night were different from anything she had experienced. Every crack of a branch or skitter of small animal made her heart race. She kept imagining footsteps getting closer, but when she looked out of her hiding spot, there was never anything there. Morning brought new problems. Sarah's water bottles were nearly empty, and she had no idea how to find more. She had read about finding streams and collecting dew, but everything looked dry and barren. The energy bars were helping with hunger, but they made her even more thirsty. More importantly, she could see smoke rising from several different locations in the distance. Some of it might be from friendly villages, but some of it could be from hostile groups that control parts of this region. Without her radio working properly, she had no way to tell which was which. Sarah tried to remember everything she had learned about survival and training. Find water first, then shelter, then figure out how to signal for rescue. But the training had always assumed she would be with other people or that help was definitely coming. She started walking again, this time trying to head toward the highest ground she could see. If she could get to a mountaintop, maybe her radio would work better, or maybe she could see landmarks that would help her figure out where she was. The climb was harder than expected. What looked like a gentle slope from a distance turned out to be steep and covered with loose rocks that shifted under her feet. Several times she nearly fell, and once she had to use her hands to pull herself up a section that was almost vertical. After 3 hours of climbing, Sarah finally reached what she thought was the top. But when she got there, she could see that it was just a false summit. The real top was still another hour away, and the path looked even more dangerous. She tried her radio anyway. "Badger Base, this is Advisor Chun. Do you copy?" Nothing but static. She tried different frequencies and emergency channels, but the result was the same. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the valley below, she could see a group of men with weapons moving along one of the trails. They were too far away to identify clearly, but they were definitely armed and seemed to be searching for something. Sarah quickly moved back from the edge and found a place to hide among some large boulders. She watched through a gap in the rocks as the group moved slowly but systematically through the area. They were checking caves and overhangs, exactly the kinds of places where someone might take shelter. She counted at least 8 men, all carrying rifles. They moved with the confidence of people who knew the terrain well and weren't worried about being spotted by aircraft. That suggested they were either local fighters or had been operating in this area for a long time. For the next 2 hours, Sarah stayed perfectly still while the group searched the lower slopes of the mountain. They came within a few hundred yards of her hiding spot at one point, close enough that she could hear them talking, though she couldn't understand the language they were speaking. When they finally moved on, Sarah had to make another difficult decision. She could stay hidden until they were completely gone, which might take hours or even days. Or she could try to move to a different location while she knew where they were. The problem was that staying put meant running out of water within the next day. Moving meant risking being spotted, but it also meant possibly finding water and getting closer to friendly territory. Sarah chose to move. She waited until the armed group was completely out of sight, then began working her way down the far side of the mountain. The terrain was different here, with more vegetation and signs that water might be nearby. She was right about the water. After an hour of careful movement, she found a small stream running between 2 rock formations. The water was clear and cold, and Sarah filled her bottles and drank as much as she could. For the first time in 2 days, she felt like she might actually survive this situation. But as she was refilling her water bottles for the second time, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices getting closer. The same group of armed men had somehow circled around and was now approaching from the direction she had just come from. Sarah grabbed her gear and ran. There was no time to be careful about noise or staying hidden. She splashed through the stream and scrambled up the rocky slope on the other side, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the voices. Behind her, she could hear shouting. They had found the stream and probably seen her footprints in the muddy ground near the water. Now they knew exactly where she was and which direction she was heading. The chase lasted for hours. Sarah would run until she was exhausted, then hide while the pursuing group searched the area around her. Then she would run again when they got too close. She was in good physical condition, but the men chasing her knew the terrain much better and didn't seem to be getting as tired. By late afternoon, Sarah found herself on a narrow ledge halfway up a cliff face. Below her was a drop of at least 50 feet onto sharp rocks. Above her, the cliff continued up for another 100 feet, too steep to climb without proper equipment. The ledge she was on extended about 20 yards in each direction before becoming too narrow to walk on safely. She was effectively trapped with nowhere to go except back the way she had come. And that way was blocked by the armed group that had been chasing her all day. Sarah could hear them talking below, though she still couldn't understand the words. It sounded like they were discussing the best way to reach her position. She had no doubt that they would figure it out eventually. She checked her radio one more time, hoping that the higher elevation might help with the signal. Still nothing but static on all channels. That's when she noticed something strange. In the distance, on the next mountain over, she could see what looked like a small aircraft circling. It was too far away to identify clearly, but it seemed to be following a search pattern. Sarah had 3 flares in her emergency kit. She had been saving them in case she saw a helicopter or other rescue aircraft nearby. But if she used one now, it would definitely give away her position to the armed men below. They would know exactly where she was and could probably reach her within an hour. On the other hand, if the aircraft was looking for her, this might be her only chance to signal for help. And if she waited much longer, the men below would find her anyway. Sarah made another crucial decision. She fired one flare straight up into the air, where it would be visible from the greatest distance. The bright red light arced high above the mountains before slowly falling back down. Almost immediately, she heard excited shouting from below. The armed group had definitely seen the flare and now knew her exact location. She could hear them starting to climb up toward the ledge. But something else was happening too. The aircraft in the distance had changed direction and was now heading toward her position. As it got closer, Sarah could see that it was a military helicopter and it was moving fast. She fired her second flare when the helicopter was close enough that she was sure the crew would see it. This time she aimed it toward the aircraft, making it as obvious as possible where she was located. The helicopter circled her position twice, and she could see people inside looking down at her through what looked like binoculars. Then it moved away and disappeared behind a nearby ridge. For a moment, Sarah thought they were leaving her behind. Maybe they had seen the armed men below and decided it was too dangerous to attempt a rescue. She couldn't blame them for making that choice, but it meant she was back to being completely on her own. Then she heard something that changed everything. It was the sound of more aircraft coming from multiple directions. The rescue helicopter hadn't left. It had gone to get help. The voices below her sounded different now. Less confident, more urgent. The armed group had also heard the aircraft and knew that the situation was about to change dramatically. Sarah could hear them moving quickly, probably try to reach her before the rescue arrived, or to get away before military forces surrounded them. Sarah used her third and final flare to mark her position one more time as the sound of helicopter rotors got louder. Whatever was about to happen, she had done everything she could to help the people try to save her. The ledge where she was trapped would soon become either her rescue point or her final stand. But for the first time in 3 days, Sarah felt like she wasn't completely alone anymore. Someone was coming to help, and they knew exactly where to find her. She pressed herself against the cliff face and waited to see who would reach her first, her rescuers or the armed men who had been hunting her across the mountains. The next few minutes would determine whether she made it home alive or disappeared forever in the hostile territory that had already tried so hard to kill her. The Hunter's Clothes and Captain Jake Morrison had been studying the satellite feeds for 6 hours straight when an emergency call came through. His eyes were red from staring at the screens, and he had consumed enough coffee to keep a small army awake. But when the communications officer burst into the command center with news of a missing cultural advisor, Jake was instantly alert. "What do we know?" he asked, already reaching for his gear. "Helicopter with mechanical failure. Crew is safe, but stranded about 40 miles northwest of here." One passenger, a civilian advisor named Sarah Chun, decided to walk to her destination. That was 18 hours ago, and she missed her scheduled radio check-in. Jake studied the map that was quickly spread across the table. The area where Sarah had gone missing was known to be dangerous. 3 different hostile groups operated in those mountains, and they were all extremely good at staying hidden from American surveillance. Weather: clear for the next 12 hours, then possible storms moving in from the west. Time of day when she went missing: started walking yesterday morning at around 0900 hours. Last known position was here. The communications officer pointed to a spot on the map, but that was from the helicopter crew's estimate. Could be anywhere in a 20-square-mile area by now. Jake Morrison was the leader of a special operations rescue team. His unit specialized in getting people out of situations exactly like this one. But every mission was different, and this one had complications that made it especially challenging. First, they were dealing with a civilian who might not know proper evasion techniques. Sarah Chun might be making mistakes that would make her easier to track, or might have inadvertently walked into an area controlled by hostile forces. Second, the terrain was extremely difficult. The mountains in this region had hidden valleys, false peaks, and cave systems that could hide someone for weeks. But they could also hide the people trying to find that someone. Third, intelligence reports suggested that at least one hostile group in the area had recently acquired new weapons and was actively looking for opportunities to capture American personnel. "Get my team assembled," Jake ordered. "Full gear, 48-hour supplies, and make sure everyone knows this is a live rescue in hostile territory." Within 30 minutes, Jake's 6-man team was boarding a helicopter equipped for mountain operations. Each team member had been chosen for specific skills that complemented the others. Rodriguez was their medic and also spoke the local language fluently. Williams was their communications specialist and could work with any radio equipment they might find. Thompson and Davis were weapons specialists with extensive mountain warfare training. Hayes was their tracker and could read signs that others would miss completely. As the helicopter lifted off, Jake studied the mission briefing one more time. Sarah Chun was 42 years old, in good physical condition, and had completed basic survival training 6 months earlier. She was carrying standard emergency gear plus a pistol that she was qualified to use, but had never fired in a combat situation. The helicopter crew that had been with her reported that she seemed confident and determined when she decided to walk to her destination. But confidence could be dangerous when it led to poor decisions in hostile territory. "What's our flight time to the search area?" Jake asked the pilot. 45 minutes if we take the direct route, but that puts us over areas where we might draw attention. I recommend going around the long way, which adds about 20 minutes, but keeps us over friendlier territory until we're close to the target area. Take the safer route. Speed won't help us if we get shot down before we can start the search. The flight gave Jake time to study aerial photographs of the region and plan their search strategy. The key was to think like someone who was lost and trying to survive. Sarah would probably head for high ground to improve radio communications and to get a better view of the terrain. She would also need to find water within a few days, but she might also be running from someone. The intelligence briefings mentioned increased activity by hostile groups in the area, and a lone American would be an extremely valuable target. Hayes, their tracker, was looking at the same photographs with a different perspective. "If I'm lost in this area, I'm going to follow the easiest paths," he said. "These ridgelines here and here would be natural routes, especially for someone who isn't used to serious mountain terrain." "What about water sources?" "There are 3 main streams in the search area. If she's smart, she'll try to stay near water without actually walking along the stream bed where she'd be easy to track." Rodriguez added his thoughts. "Local groups in this area usually move in the early morning and late afternoon. If they're hunting someone, they'll use the daylight hours when tracking is easier. Which means our window to find her first is right now," Jake concluded. "Mid-morning, when visibility is good, but most hostile activity hasn't started yet." The pilot's voice came through their headsets. "Coming up on the search area now. I can see the helicopter that had the mechanical failure, and there are people moving around it. Looks like they're working on repairs." Jake could see the disabled aircraft on a flat area between 2 hills. Smoke was rising from a small signal fire, indicating that the crew was safe and trying to attract attention. But there was no sign of Sarah Chun. "Take us to the last known position where she started walking," Jake ordered. The helicopter circled the area twice while the team studied the ground below. Hayes spotted something immediately. There, about 200 yards from the helicopter. Footprints heading northeast toward that ridgeline. "Looks like a single person carrying a pack. Can you follow the trail from up here?" "For a while, but we're going to need to get on the ground to really track her properly." Jake made the decision to insert his team at the starting point of Sarah's trail. They would track her on foot while staying in radio contact with the helicopter, which would provide overwatch and be ready for immediate extraction if they found her. The landing was quick and efficient. Within 2 minutes, the 6-man team was on the ground with all their equipment, while the helicopter moved to a safe distance to wait for further instructions. Hayes immediately began studying the tracks that Sarah had left behind. Even to Jake's untrained eye, the trail was relatively easy to follow. Sarah's boots had a distinctive tread pattern, and she was apparently walking at a steady pace without trying to hide her movement. She's heading for high ground, Hayes confirmed after examining the first few hundred yards of tracks, moving at about 2 miles per hour, which is reasonable for this terrain. But she's not taking any precautions about concealing her route. That was both good news and bad news. Good because it would make her easier for the rescue team to follow. Bad because it would also make her easier for hostile forces to track. The team moved quickly but carefully along Sarah's trail. Rodriguez monitored radio frequencies to listen for any chatter from local groups. Williams maintained contact with their helicopter and with the command center back at base. The two weapons specialists, Thompson and Davis, watched for signs of other people in the area. After an hour of tracking, Hayes found something concerning. "She stopped here for a while," he said, pointing to an area where the footprints were more concentrated. "Looks like she was trying to figure out which way to go." The trail splits here into 3 different paths. Jake could see what Sarah had been facing. 3 animal trails led in different directions, and without good map reading skills, it would be difficult to know which one to take. Which way did she go? Middle path, heading more toward the east than she probably intended. This route is going to take her into the valley instead of toward the village she was trying to reach. That meant Sarah was not only lost, but she was also heading in the wrong direction. If she continued on her current path, she would move deeper into territory that was known to be controlled by hostile forces. How long ago was she here? Hayes examined the tracks more closely, looking at how the edges have been affected by wind and the small amount of moisture in the morning air. Maybe 18 hours. She passed through here yesterday evening, which means she probably spent the night somewhere along this trail. The team continued following the tracks, but now they were also watching for signs that other people had been in the area. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. Davis spotted the first indication that Sarah wasn't alone in these mountains. "Boot prints here," he said quietly. "Different tread pattern, multiple individuals, probably at least 6 people." Hayes examined the new tracks while the rest of the team took defensive positions. "These are fresher than hers," he concluded. "Maybe 12 hours old. And they're following her trail." Jake felt his heart rate increase. The worst-case scenario was developing exactly as he had feared. Sarah was being hunted by a group that outnumbered her and knew the terrain much better than she did. Can you tell how far behind her they are? Hard to say exactly, but they're definitely following her specific route. Not just using the same trail, but actually tracking her footprints. The team moved faster now, knowing that they were in a race against time. Sarah had a head start, but the people following her had advantages in numbers, local knowledge, and probably better equipment for mountain operations. After another 30 minutes of tracking, they found Sarah's overnight shelter. The small cave showed clear signs that someone had spent several hours there. There were compressed areas in the dirt where she had laid out her sleeping bag, and Hayes found a small piece of wrapper from an energy bar. She was here for most of the night, Hayes determined. Left early this morning, probably around dawn. But more concerning were the other signs around the cave. The hostile group tracking Sarah had also found this location and had spent time examining it. "They know exactly where she spent the night," Rodriguez observed, "and they can probably estimate how many hours ahead of them she is." Jake radioed their helicopter pilot with an update. "We're following the target's trail, but she's being pursued by at least 6 hostiles. Request any available air support for surveillance and possible extraction." "Roger that. I've got eyes on your position and am scanning the area ahead of your route. No movement visible from up here, but there's a lot of terrain that could hide people." The team pressed on, following both sets of tracks through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah's route was leading them up toward a high ridge, while the tracks of her pursuers showed that they were moving more confidently and probably closing the distance. Then, Hayes found something that changed the entire situation. "She went off the main trail here," he said, pointing to tracks that led toward a steep slope covered with loose rocks. "Looks like she was trying to climb to higher ground, probably to get better radio reception." Jake could see the route Sarah had taken. It led up to what appeared to be a cliff face with a narrow ledge running along it. The climb looked dangerous even with proper equipment, and Sarah was carrying only basic gear. Did the people following her go the same way? Hayes studied the ground carefully. No, they continued on the main trail for another 100 yards, then split up. Looks like they're trying to surround the area she climbed into. That suggested a level of tactical thinking that was very bad news for Sarah. Her pursuers weren't just following her blindly. They were anticipating her movements and trying to cut off her escape routes. Jake radioed the helicopter again. We need eyes on the cliff area about half a mile ahead of our position. Target may be trapped on a ledge, with hostiles moving to surround her. Copy that. Moving to investigate now. The rescue team began climbing toward the cliff face, but they had to move carefully to avoid being spotted by the same group that was hunting Sarah. Jake knew that they were dealing with experienced fighters who would be watching for exactly this kind of rescue attempt. As they got closer to the cliff, they could hear voices echoing off the rock walls. The sounds were too distorted to understand clearly, but it was obvious that Sarah's pursuers had found her and were trying to reach her position. Then, they heard something that made Jake's blood run cold, the unmistakable crack of gunfire echoing through the mountains. Single shots, fired at precise intervals like someone shooting at a specific target. Jake's team was still 10 minutes away from reaching the cliff face, and it sounded like Sarah's time had just run out. The question now was whether they could reach her before her captors did, or whether they were already too late to save her life. Hashtag signals in the sky, Sarah's hands were shaking as she gripped the rock face behind her. The gunshots had stopped, but she could still hear voices getting closer from below. The narrow ledge where she was trapped felt even smaller now, like the mountain itself was closing in around her. She tried to count how many different voices she could hear, but the echoes made it impossible to be sure. At least 5, maybe more. They were definitely climbing toward her position, and from the sound of it, they knew exactly where she was. The flares had worked. She was certain the helicopter crew had seen her signals and knew her location. But that didn't help her immediate problem, which was that armed men would reach her ledge within the next hour. Sarah checked her equipment one more time. The pistol felt heavy in her hands, and she tried to remember everything from her weapons training 6 months ago. 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Safety off, finger along the trigger guard until ready to fire. Breathe steadily. Aim for center mass, squeeze the trigger slowly. But training on a controlled range was very different from facing armed men who were trying to capture or kill you. Sarah had never shot at another person, and she wasn't sure she would be able to do it when the moment came. A new sound reached her ears, helicopter rotors, but different from the search aircraft she had seen earlier. This sounded like multiple helicopters, and they were getting closer fast. The voices below, suddenly, changed in tone. Instead of the confident discussion she had been hearing, there was now urgent shouting. Whoever was climbing toward her had also heard the helicopters and knew that the situation was about to change. Sarah pressed herself against the cliff face and tried to make herself as small as possible. If there was going to be a firefight, she didn't want to get caught in the crossfire between her pursuers and whoever was coming to rescue her. 2 helicopters appeared over the ridge in front of her, flying fast and low. They were clearly military aircraft, but Sarah couldn't tell if they were American or from another country. The markings were too far away to read clearly. One helicopter circled her position while the other moved to a different area. She could see people inside both aircraft, and some of them appeared to be looking at her through binoculars or other optical equipment. Then, something happened that Sarah hadn't expected. One of the helicopters began lowering a rope toward her ledge. At the end of the rope was a harness that would allow someone to be lifted up into the aircraft. But the helicopter couldn't get close enough to the cliff face to actually reach her. The rotor wash was creating dangerous wind currents, and the pilot was struggling to maintain a stable hover position near the vertical rock wall. Sarah understood the problem immediately. The ledge where she was trapped was in a location that made helicopter rescue almost impossible. The cliff face was too steep, and There wasn't enough space for the aircraft to maneuver safely. She looked around desperately, trying to find a way to reach the rope that was dangling about 20 feet away from her position. The ledge continued for another 15 yards to her left, but it got progressively narrower until it disappeared completely. To her right, the ledge was wider, but didn't extend very far before ending at a vertical drop. Neither direction would get her close enough to the rescue rope. The voices from below were getting closer, and now Sarah could hear the sound of boots on rock as her pursuers climbed up toward her position. They would reach her within minutes, and the helicopter crew obviously knew it. The aircraft with the rescue rope moved away from the cliff face, but it didn't leave the area. Instead, it took up a position where the crew could observe the approaches to Sarah's ledge. The second helicopter disappeared behind a nearby ridge, and Sarah wondered if it had given up on the rescue attempt. Maybe the pilots had decided that the risk was too great, or maybe they were running low on fuel. Then she heard something that gave her hope, the sound of rappelling equipment being deployed. Someone was coming down the cliff face from above, using ropes and climbing gear to reach her position. Sarah looked up and saw a figure in military gear descending rapidly toward her ledge. The person was moving with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before, and they were heavily armed. But they weren't the only ones moving. The voices from below were much closer now, and Sarah could see movement in the shadows of the rock formations. Her pursuers were almost within shooting range, and they knew that time was running out. The figure rappelling down the cliff reached Sarah's ledge just as the first armed man appeared on the trail below. Sarah found herself caught between two groups of armed people, and she had no way to know which ones were trying to help her and which ones were trying to capture her. "American military," the figure beside her shouted. "Get down and stay down." Sarah immediately dropped to the ground as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The soldier who had rappelled down to her position was returning fire toward the trail below, while speaking rapidly into a radio attached to his chest. "Package located, taking heavy fire. Need immediate extraction support." More ropes appeared over the edge of the cliff as additional soldiers began descending towards Sarah's position. But the ledge wasn't big enough for more than two people, and the incoming fire was becoming more intense. "Ma'am, we need to move you to a better position," the soldier beside her shouted over the noise of gunfire and helicopter rotors. "Can you handle a rappel harness?" Sarah nodded, though she had never actually rappelled before. The soldier quickly fitted her with a climbing harness and attached her to his rope system. "When I say go, you're going to step backward off this ledge and trust the rope to hold you. I'll control the descent. You just keep your feet against the rock face and try not to swing into anything sharp." The idea of deliberately stepping off a cliff while people were shooting at her seemed like the worst possible plan, but staying on the ledge was clearly not an option. More armed men were appearing on the trail below, and they had better positions to shoot from. "Go," the soldier yelled. Sarah forced herself to step backward off the ledge, fighting every instinct that told her this was a terrible idea. For a terrifying moment, she felt like she was falling freely. Then the rope caught her weight, and she was sliding down the cliff face at a controlled speed. Bullets were striking the rock around them, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. Sarah kept her eyes closed and tried to keep her feet in contact with the cliff face as the soldier had instructed. The descent seemed to last forever, but it was probably only 30 seconds before they reached a wider ledge about 50 feet below Sarah's original position. Here, there were 3 more soldiers waiting with additional equipment and better defensive positions. "Medical check," one of them said immediately, examining Sarah for injuries. "Any hits? Any bleeding?" "I don't think so," Sarah managed to say, though her whole body was shaking with adrenaline. "Good. We're going to move you to the extraction point, but we need to do it fast. The bad guys are trying to flank our position, and we can't hold this area indefinitely." The extraction point turned out to be another 100 yards along the cliff face, where the terrain was more suitable for helicopter operations. The team moved quickly but carefully with 2 soldiers ahead and 2 behind Sarah, all of them scanning for threats. The helicopter was waiting when they reached the extraction point, hovering as low as possible with its side door open. A crew member was manning a machine gun mounted in the doorway, providing covering fire toward the areas where hostile forces might appear. Getting Sarah into the helicopter required another leap of faith. The aircraft couldn't land on the rocky terrain, so she had to jump from the cliff edge to the helicopter's side door while the pilot maintained a precise hover position. 2 soldiers went first, demonstrating how to make the jump safely. Then it was Sarah's turn. With 1 soldier holding her harness and another ready to catch her, she jumped the 6-foot gap between the cliff and the helicopter door. Strong hands pulled her into the aircraft, and she found herself lying on the floor of the helicopter, surrounded by military personnel and equipment. The relief was overwhelming. After 3 days of being lost and hunted, she was finally safe. But the mission wasn't over yet. The soldiers who had rescued her were still on the cliff face, and they needed to be extracted as well. The helicopter moved to different positions to pick up each team member, while the gunner provided continuous covering fire. The last soldier to board was the one who had first rappelled down to Sarah's position. As he climbed into the helicopter, she could see that he had been hit by gunfire. There was blood on his left arm, and he was favoring his right leg. "I'm fine," he said when the medic moved to examine his wounds. "Just scratches. Let's get out of here before they bring up anything heavier than small arms." The helicopter climbed rapidly away from the cliff face and headed toward friendly territory. Sarah watched through the window as the mountains fell away below them, finally allowing herself to believe that her ordeal was truly over. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Hayes," the wounded soldier said. "My team leader wants to debrief you as soon as possible, but first we need to get you checked out by medical and get some food and water into you." Sarah nodded, suddenly realizing how exhausted and dehydrated she was. The adrenaline that had kept her going for the past hour was starting to wear off, and she felt like she might pass out. "The helicopter crew that was with you when this started, they're fine," Hayes continued. "Got the bird fixed and flew out about 6 hours ago. They were pretty worried about you." "How did you find me so quickly?" Sarah asked. "I was lost for 3 days. Your flares," Hayes explained. "We were already in the area looking for you when you fired them. And honestly, you did a good job of staying alive in hostile territory. A lot of people wouldn't have made it as long as you did." Sarah wasn't sure if she felt proud or embarrassed about the whole situation. She had made the decision to walk alone to her destination, which had led to 3 days of terror and had put other people at risk to rescue her. But she had also survived against considerable odds and had managed to signal for help when the opportunity arose. The helicopter was now flying over territory that looked more familiar. Sarah could see roads and buildings in the distance, signs that they were approaching areas controlled by friendly forces. "There's a forward operating base about 20 minutes from here," the medic told her. "Full medical facilities, communications equipment, so you can call home, and a hot meal. You'll probably want to sleep for about 12 hours after that." Sleep sounded like the best idea Sarah had heard in days. But first, she wanted to understand what had happened and why she had been hunted so persistently through the mountains. "The people who were chasing me," she asked Hayes, "do you know who they were?" Hayes exchanged glances with the other soldiers before answering. "We're still working on identification, but initial assessment suggests they were a local militia group that's been trying to capture American personnel for ransom or propaganda purposes. You were exactly the kind of target they've been looking for." That explained the systematic tracking and the coordinated attempt to surround her position on the cliff. Sarah had walked directly into the operational area of a group that specialized in capturing isolated Americans. Will they try again? I mean, will other people be at risk because of what happened? That's above my pay grade, Hayes admitted, but I can tell you that this area is going to get a lot more attention from our intelligence people. The fact that they were operating so close to our regular flight paths is something that needs to be addressed. The helicopter was descending now toward a sprawling base that looked like a small city built in the middle of nowhere. Sarah could see runways, vehicle depots, communication towers, and hundreds of buildings arranged in neat rows. "Welcome back to civilization," the medic said with a smile. "It's not much, but it's got everything you need to recover from the past few days." As the helicopter touched down, Sarah realized that her 3-day ordeal had taught her things about herself that she never would have learned in training or normal operations. She had discovered that she could survive in hostile territory, make difficult decisions under extreme pressure, and keep functioning even when everything seemed hopeless. But she had also learned that survival sometimes required accepting help from others, even when that help came with significant risks. The soldiers who had rescued her had put their own lives in danger to bring her home safely, and one of them had been wounded in the process. Sarah stepped out of the helicopter onto solid ground for the first time in 3 days, supported by the medic because her legs were shaking too badly to hold her weight. But she was alive, she was safe, and she was ready to tell the story of how she had survived being stranded in some of the most hostile territory in the world. #The pursuit intensifies. Captain Morrison's team was moving faster now, pushing through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and tear equipment. The sound of gunfire from ahead had stopped, but that could mean anything: successful rescue, successful capture, or something worse. "Radio check with Overwatch," Morrison ordered, breathing hard from the rapid climb toward the cliff area. Williams immediately contacted their helicopter support. "Raven 1, this is ground team. What's your status on the target area?" "Ground team, be advised, multiple aircraft now operating in your area. Unknown nationality, but they appear to be conducting rescue operations. We observed rappelling activity and heard sustained gunfire approximately 10 minutes ago." Morrison felt his heart sink. Multiple aircraft meant that either another friendly unit had beaten them to the rescue, or hostile forces with air support had captured Saracen. Either way, his team might be walking into a situation that was much more complex than a simple search and rescue. "Any positive identification on the aircraft?" "Negative, but flight patterns and equipment suggest military rather than civilian. No hostile action taken against our aircraft." That was encouraging, but not definitive. In this region, several different military forces operated, and not all of them were friendly to American personnel. Morrison needed to know exactly what his team was walking into before they reached the cliff area. Hayes, who had been tracking footprint for the past hour, suddenly stopped and raised his hand for the team to halt. "Got something here," he said quietly. Morrison moved forward to see what Hayes had discovered. On the ground were clear signs that multiple people had stopped in this location recently. Spent shell casings glinted in the sunlight, and there were deep gouges in the earth where someone had dug in for cover. "Looks like there was a firefight here within the past hour," Hayes observed, examining the evidence. "At least 2 different weapons, maybe more, and blood trails leading in different directions." Rodriguez knelt beside one of the blood trails, using his medical training to assess what had happened. "This is not a fatal amount of bleeding," he concluded. "Probably a minor wound, someone who is still mobile after being hit. But whose blood was it? Saracen's? Or someone who had been chasing her?" "Movement ahead," Davis called out from his position, watching the approaches to the cliff area. People rappelling down from the top of the ridge. Morrison raised his binoculars and studied the figures descending the cliff face. They were definitely military personnel, wearing gear that looked American but could have been from several different countries. More importantly, they were moving with the precision of professionals, not the irregular movements of local militia groups. "Ground team, this is Raven 1, came the voice from their helicopter support. "Be advised, I have positive identification on one of the aircraft in your area. That's a U.S. military helicopter, probably special operations." Morrison felt relief wash over him. Another American unit had reached Saracen first, which meant she was probably safe. But it also meant that his team had missed their primary objective and might now be dealing with a complex coordination problem between different military units. "Raven 1, can you establish communication with the other aircraft? We need to coordinate our operations to avoid friendly fire incidents." "Roger that, attempting contact now." While Williams worked on communications, Morrison studied the tactical situation developing around the cliff face. Even if Sarah had been rescued successfully, there were still hostile forces in the area that needed to be dealt with. His team was in a perfect position to provide support for whatever operation was taking place. Hayes, can you determine how many hostiles were operating in this area? Hayes examined the tracks and fighting positions more carefully. I count at least 8 different individuals, probably more. They had good fields of fire and knew the terrain well. But they left in a hurry when the helicopters showed up. Which direction did they go? Split up into at least 3 groups, heading for different escape routes. Smart tactics, harder to track multiple small groups than one large one. Morrison made a tactical decision. Even if Sarah Chun had been rescued, the hostile forces that had been hunting her were still operating in the area. His team could contribute to the overall mission by tracking down those forces and preventing them from threatening other American personnel. Contact Raven 1 and get us coordinates on the extraction that just took place. Then we're going to follow the hostiles who fled the area and see if we can identify who they are and where they're based. The next hour was spent carefully tracking the escape routes taken by Sarah's pursuers. Hayes was in his element, reading signs that told the story of people moving quickly but trying to avoid detection. Boot prints in soft earth, broken vegetation, disturbed rocks. All of it painted a picture of experienced fighters who knew they were being hunted. This group knows what they're doing, Hayes reported as they followed one of the escape trails. They're using terrain to break up their tracks, avoiding areas where they'd be visible from the air, and changing direction frequently to confuse pursuit. But Hayes was better at tracking than they were at hiding. The trail led through a series of ravines and hidden valleys that provided excellent concealment, but also channeled movement into predictable routes. After 2 hours of pursuit, the team reached a position overlooking a small village nestled between 2 hills. Through binoculars, Morrison could see several buildings, including what appeared to be a communications facility with large antennas. "This isn't just a farming village," Rodriguez observed, studying the layout through his own binoculars. "Those antenna arrays are military-grade equipment, and look at the way the buildings are positioned for defense." Morrison could see what Rodriguez meant. The village was laid out like a military compound, disguised as a civilian settlement. The buildings provided interlocking fields of fire. There were prepared fighting positions around the perimeter, and several vehicles looked like they had been modified for military use. "Ground team, this is Raven 1. I have your position and am observing the village you're watching. Be advised, thermal imaging shows approximately 20 people moving around down there, and at least half of them appear to be armed." 20 people was more than Morrison's 6-man team could handle in a direct confrontation, especially if they were defending prepared positions. But gathering intelligence about this facility might be more valuable than engaging in a firefight. "Williams, get on the radio and pass this location to higher headquarters. They need to know that there's a hostile base operating this close to our regular flight paths." While Williams called in their discovery, Morrison continued studying the village through his binoculars. Something about the place looked familiar, and after a few minutes, he realized why. The layout matched intelligence reports about a suspected staging area for attacks against American forces. "Hayes, can you get us closer without being detected? I want to confirm some details about this place before we call in airstrikes." Hayes studied the terrain between their position and the village. "There's a drainage ditch that runs along the north side. We could get within 200 yards without being seen, but getting back out would be tricky if they spotted us." "Do it. Rodriguez and Williams, you stay here as Overwatch and maintain communications. Thompson, Davis, and Hayes, we're going to get a closer look at this place." The approach to the village took 45 minutes of careful movement through terrain that offered concealment, but made quiet movement difficult. Every step had to be planned to avoid dislodging rocks or snapping branches that might alert sentries to their presence. When they reached the drainage ditch Hayes had identified, Morrison had a clear view of the village from less than 200 yards away. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions about the nature of this facility. The vehicles weren't just modified for military use. They were equipped with weapons mounts and communication equipment that suggested a level of sophistication beyond what local militia groups usually possessed. The people moving around the compound were armed with modern weapons and moved with military discipline. Most concerning were the prisoners. Morrison could see at least 3 people who were clearly not part of the hostile group. They were restrained and under guard, suggesting that this facility was being used to hold captives. Hayes, can you get photos of the prisoners? Command is going to want positive identification. Hayes had a camera with a powerful telephoto lens specifically designed for reconnaissance work. He spent several minutes taking photographs of the compound, the equipment, and the people being held there. Got clear shots of 2 males and 1 female, Hayes reported quietly. The female looks like she might be local, but the males could be American or European based on their clothing and physical appearance. Morrison felt the mission parameters changing in real time. What had started as a search and rescue operation for 1 missing person was turning into something much larger. This village was apparently a base of operations for a sophisticated hostile group that was actively capturing and holding prisoners. Thompson, what kind of defenses are you seeing? Thompson had been studying the compound's security arrangements through his weapon scope. Multiple guard posts, overlapping fields of fire, and at least 2 heavy weapons positions. They've got this place set up to repel a serious assault. Weak points. The drainage system we're using extends all the way into the compound. If we could get inside their perimeter, we might be able to create enough confusion to extract the prisoners. But it would be extremely high risk. Morrison weighed his options. His team's original mission had been to find and rescue Sarah Chun, which had been completed successfully by another unit. Now, they had stumbled onto what appeared to be a major hostile facility that was holding other American prisoners. Protocol dictated that he should report the discovery and wait for a larger force to conduct a proper assault. But if the prisoners were being tortured or were scheduled for execution, waiting might mean letting people die who could be saved. Williams, what's our communication status with higher command? Williams had been monitoring radio traffic while the reconnaissance team gathered intelligence. I've been in contact with the operations center. They confirmed successful extraction of the original target and are very interested in our current discovery. They're requesting detailed intelligence about the compound before committing additional resources. How long before we can expect reinforcements? Minimum 4 hours, probably more like 8, given the coordination required for an operation this size. 8 hours might be too long if the prisoners were in immediate danger. Morrison needed to make a command decision about whether his small team should attempt a rescue operation or wait for proper support. Hayes, is there any way to get close enough to communicate with the prisoners? Find out who they are and what their status is. Hayes studied the compound layout one more time. Maybe. If we wait until dark, I might be able to get to that building where they're being held. But if something goes wrong, we'd be trapped inside their perimeter with no good escape route. Morrison looked at his watch. It was still early afternoon, which meant waiting until dark would take several hours. But attempting a daylight approach to the prisoner building would be almost certainly suicidal. All right, we wait for darkness. But we prep for a possible rescue operation in case we determine that the prisoners are in immediate danger. The next few hours were spent in careful observation and planning. The team identified guard schedules, weapon positions, and possible escape routes. They also maintained radio contact with their command center, providing regular updates about the compound and its activities. As the sun began to set, Morrison realized that his mission had evolved far beyond what anyone had anticipated when they set out to find one missing cultural advisor. Sarah Chun was safe, but now his team was potentially the only hope for other Americans who might be facing torture or execution in a hostile compound. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether those prisoners went home alive or became casualties of a war that most people didn't even know was being fought in these remote mountains. # the final extraction darkness fell over the mountains like a heavy curtain. bringing with it the kind of silence that made every small sound seem amplified. Captain Morrison's team had been watching the hostile compound for 6 hours, and they had learned things that made waiting for reinforcements feel impossible. The prisoners weren't just being held, they were being systematically interrogated. Through his night vision scope, Thompson had observed multiple sessions where captives were taken from the building and subjected to what could only be described as torture. 2 of the prisoners appeared to be injured, and one hadn't been seen at all for the past 3 hours. "Command, this is ground team," Morrison whispered into his radio. "Request immediate guidance on rules of engagement. We have visual confirmation of prisoner abuse in progress." The response came back after a long pause. "Ground team, maintain observation and gather intelligence. Reinforcements en route. ETA approximately 4 hours. Do not engage unless prisoners face imminent execution." 4 hours might as well have been 4 days. Morrison had seen enough military operations to know that schedules rarely held when multiple units were involved. The prisoners might be dead before help arrived. Hayes crawled back from his forward observation position with new information. "I got close enough to hear some conversation," he reported quietly. "They're planning to move the prisoners at dawn. Sounds like they're taking them to a different location, probably for execution or transfer to a larger organization." Dawn was 6 hours away. If the hostile group moved the prisoners before reinforcements arrived, they might never be found again. "What about the approach route through the drainage ditch?" Morrison asked. "Still viable, but I identified 2 additional guard posts that we missed earlier. Getting to the prisoner building is possible, but getting back out with 3 injured people would be extremely difficult." Morrison studied the compound through his night vision equipment one more time. The building where the prisoners were held was about 50 yards from the drainage ditch. There were guards posted at regular intervals, but they seemed more focused on watching for external threats than internal movement. Rodriguez, medical assessment. "If we extract 3 prisoners who may have been tortured, what are we looking at in terms of treatment and transport?" Rodriguez had been thinking about exactly that question for the past hour. "Depends on the severity of injuries, but we're probably looking at people who can't move quickly or quietly. If they're badly hurt, we might need to carry them, which would slow us down significantly." Thompson, Davis, defensive assessment. "Can we hold the compound long enough for helicopter extraction if we get inside?" Thompson had been studying the compound's defensive positions from the perspective of someone trying to hold them rather than attack them. "Maybe if we could take control of their heavy weapons positions. But we'd be outnumbered at least 3-1, and they know the terrain better than we do." Morrison weighed all the factors one more time. His team was small, but extremely well trained. They had the advantage of surprise and superior night vision equipment. The prisoners were depending on them, and waiting for reinforcements meant accepting that those people might die. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Hayes and I will infiltrate through the drainage ditch and attempt to reach the prisoners. Rodriguez comes with us to provide medical support. Thompson, Davis, and Williams maintain overwatch and prepared to provide covering fire if we need to fight our way out." "What about extraction?" Williams asked. "If the infiltration is successful, we signal for immediate helicopter extraction from the compound itself. If it fails, we fall back to this position and wait for reinforcements to conduct a proper assault." The team spent 30 minutes preparing equipment and reviewing the plan. Each person would carry only essential gear to minimize noise and maximize mobility. Communications would be maintained through throat microphones and earpieces that would allow silent coordination. At midnight, Morrison, Hayes, and Rodriguez began their approach to the compound through the drainage ditch. The route was exactly as Hayes had described: narrow, muddy, and treacherous, but it provided concealment from the guard posts. Moving through the ditch required crawling for most of the distance, which meant progress was slow and exhausting. Every few minutes, they had to freeze while guards walked patrol routes that brought them close to the drainage system. After 45 minutes, they reached the point where the ditch entered the compound. Here, they faced their first major obstacle: a heavy metal grate that covered the drainage outlet. The grate was locked, but Hayes had anticipated this problem and brought bolt cutters designed for exactly this type of barrier. Cutting through the metal took 10 careful minutes, with Morrison and Rodriguez watching for guards while Hayes worked as quietly as possible. When the hole was finally large enough for a person to crawl through, they found themselves inside the compound's perimeter. The prisoner building was 30 yards away across open ground that offered no concealment. Between their position and the building were two roving guards who followed predictable patterns, but whose timing would have to be perfect. Hayes timed the guard rotations for another 10 minutes before identifying a window of opportunity. "We've got 45 seconds when both guards will be facing away from our route," he whispered. "Once we start moving, we can't stop or hesitate." The sprint across the open ground felt like it lasted forever, though Morrison's watch later showed it took only 38 seconds. They reached the wall of the prisoner building without being detected and immediately began searching for an entry point. The building had been constructed as a simple storage facility, but converted for holding prisoners. There were no windows at ground level, but Hayes found a ventilation grate near the roof line that looked large enough for a person to crawl through. Getting to the ventilation grate required climbing the outside wall of the building, which would expose them to observation from multiple guard positions. But Rodriguez spotted something that changed their approach entirely. "Door on the back side," he whispered, pointing to an entrance that was hidden from most of the compound but appeared to be unguarded. The door was locked, but it was a simple mechanism that Hayes could defeat with basic tools. Within 3 minutes, they were inside the building, moving carefully through a storage area filled with equipment and supplies. The prisoners were being held in a room at the far end of the building. As the team approached, they could hear voices, one speaking in a local language, others responding in what sounded like English. Morrison signaled for Rodriguez to prepare medical equipment, while Hayes positioned himself to provide security. Then, Morrison carefully opened the door to the room where the prisoners were held. 3 people were inside, 2 men and 1 woman, all showing signs of rough treatment, but apparently conscious and alert. The woman appeared to be local, but the 2 men were definitely American based on their clothing and appearance. "U.S. military," Morrison whispered, showing his identification. "We're here to get you out." The reaction was immediate relief, mixed with concern about the feasibility of escape. One of the men, who appeared to be military personnel himself, quickly explained the situation. "I'm Sergeant Collins, Army Intelligence. This is Dr. Patterson, civilian contractor, and Amira, local interpreter who was captured with us 3 days ago. Dr. Patterson has a broken rib, and Amira has injuries to her leg. We can move, but not fast." Rodriguez immediately began examining the injuries while Morrison assessed the tactical situation. They now had 3 additional people to evacuate, 2 of whom were injured. The original plan of moving quickly and quietly was no longer viable. "Hayes, can we bring our extraction helicopter directly to this building?" Hayes considered the question while studying the compound layout. "Maybe if we can neutralize the heavy weapons positions first. But that would mean a full-scale firefight with 20-plus hostiles." Morrison made another command decision. "Signal Thompson and Davis to begin suppressive fire on the weapon positions. Williams calls for immediate helicopter extraction to our current location. We're going to fight our way out rather than try to sneak out." The next few minutes were a carefully orchestrated sequence of violence and confusion. Thompson and Davis opened fire on the compound's heavy weapons positions, creating enough chaos to mask the movement of the prisoner extraction team. Williams radioed for immediate helicopter support, while Morrison's team prepared to move the prisoners to an open area suitable for extraction. The injured prisoners would need assistance, but they were mobile enough to participate in their own rescue. The response from the compound's defenders was swift and intense. Within seconds of the first gunshots, the entire facility was on alert, with guards running toward defensive positions and searchlights sweeping the area. But Morrison's team had achieved their primary objective. The prisoners were free and moving toward the extraction point. Rodriguez was supporting Dr. Patterson, who was struggling with his broken rib, while Hayes helped Amira move despite her leg injury. Ground team, this is Raven 1, came the voice from their helicopter support. I have your signal and am inbound for immediate extraction. Be advised, multiple hostile positions are engaging with small arms fire. The extraction zone was a small courtyard in the center of the compound, surrounded by buildings, but open enough for helicopter operations. Getting there required crossing 50 yards of ground that was now being swept by defensive fire from multiple positions. Thompson and Davis were providing covering fire from their overwatch positions, but they were outnumbered and would soon be overrun if the compound's defenders could organize an effective counterattack. Move, 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 Morrison shouted as the team ran toward the extraction zone. The helicopter appeared over the compound walls just as they reached the courtyard. The pilot was flying aggressively, using the aircraft's maneuverability to avoid defensive fire while positioning for a rapid pickup. But the helicopter couldn't land in the confined space. Instead, it hovered low enough for people to climb aboard while the crew chief provided covering fire with a door-mounted machine gun. Getting the prisoners aboard required lifting them into the aircraft while it maintained a low hover position. Rodriguez went first, then helped pull Dr. Patterson into the helicopter. Amira was next, supported by Hayes, who climbed aboard with her. Morrison was the last aboard, and as he climbed into the aircraft, he could see hostile forces moving to surround the courtyard. The extraction had been successful, but just barely. Thompson and Davis exfiltrate to backup extraction point. Morrison radioed to his team members who were still providing overwatch. Raven 2 will pick you up in 5 minutes. The helicopter climbed rapidly away from the compound, carrying 3 rescued prisoners and the team members who had extracted them. In the distance, Morrison could see muzzle flashes as Thompson and Davis fought their way to their own extraction point. As they flew toward the safety of friendly territory, Morrison reflected on how the mission had evolved from a simple search and rescue to a complex operation involving multiple prisoners and hostile facilities. Sarah Chin's ordeal had led to the discovery of a significant threat and the rescue of additional American personnel who might have died if the compound hadn't been found. Dr. Patterson was receiving medical treatment from Rodriguez while providing information about what he had learned during his captivity. The hostile group was apparently part of a larger organization that specialized in capturing and ransoming American personnel, and the compound they had just escaped from was one of several similar facilities in the region. Amira was also providing valuable intelligence about the group's operations and leadership. Her information would help military planners understand the scope of the threat and develop strategies for dealing with similar situations in the future. What did you end up captured? Morrison asked Dr. Patterson when Rodriguez had finished treating his injuries. Vehicle breakdown during a routine supply run, Patterson explained. We thought we were in a safe area, but they had people watching the roads. Grabbed us within an hour of our vehicle breaking down. Morrison realized how easily any military operation could turn into a situation like the one they had just resolved. Equipment failures, bad weather, wrong turns. Any of these could leave personnel stranded in hostile territory where they would become targets for groups that specialized in capture and ransom. Ground team, this is Raven 2, came the radio call from the second helicopter. Package delivered safely to friendly territory. Thompson and Davis are aboard and uninjured. The successful extraction of all personnel meant that the mission had achieved far more than its original objectives. Sarah Chun was safe, 3 additional prisoners had been rescued, and a significant hostile facility had been identified for future action. But Morrison knew that the real significance of the mission was what it revealed about the nature of the threat in this region. Groups like the one operating from the compound they had just assaulted represented a sophisticated and persistent danger to American personnel operating in remote areas. As their helicopter approached the forward operating base where this had all begun, Morrison could see the lights of the facility spread out below them. It looked like a small city in the wilderness, a bubble of safety and civilization surrounded by territory that could be deadly to anyone who ventured into it alone. Sarah Chun would be somewhere down there, probably debriefing with intelligence officers about her 3 days of survival in hostile territory. Her experience would become part of the knowledge base that helped future personnel survive similar situations. But more importantly, her ordeal had led to the discovery and disruption of a hostile operation that might have claimed many more victims if it had been allowed to continue operating undetected. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad, and Morrison helped unload the rescued prisoners for immediate medical attention and debriefing. Another successful mission was complete, but he knew there would be others. In this part of the world, the line between routine operations and life-or-death survival situations was often thinner than anyone wanted to acknowledge.